Stanley Kubrick began his career behind the camera as a still photographer for Look, a photography magazine based in New York City. This background makes sense, given the emphasis on imagery that comes through in his films. Viewing Kubrick's movies with this in mind, Stanley as the photographer reveals how he approached the medium as a primarily visual and sensory experience. This also explains why his movies, even if the story isn't entirely clear, always look stunning. Kubrick made numerous statements in interviews over the years that provide invaluable insight into how we might regard his films. In 1968, when asked to comment on the metaphysical significance of 2001: A Space Odyssey, he replied, "It's not a message I ever intended to convey in words. I tried to create a visual experience, one that bypasses verbalized pigeonholing and directly penetrates the subconscious with an emotional and philosophic content." The Playboy interview, 1968. When interviewed by biographer Michel Simont in 1980, printed in full in Simont's book Kubrick, he made a statement that applies perfectly to Eyes Wide Shut. "Realism is probably the best way to dramatize argument and ideas. Fantasy may deal best with themes which lie primarily in the unconscious." Simont, 181. In Stanley Kubrick: The Complete Films, Paul Duncan discusses the interpretive quality of Kubrick's work, stating, "He was very careful not to present his own views of the meaning of his films and to leave them open to interpretation." Duncan, 10. Kubrick himself commented on this early in his career. "One of the things I always find extremely difficult when a picture's finished is when a writer or a film reviewer asks, 'Now, what is it that you were trying to say in that picture?' And without being thought too presumptuous for using this analogy, I like to remember what T.S. Eliot said to someone who had asked him, I believe it was the wasteland, what he meant by the poem. He replied, 'I meant what I said. If I could have said it any differently, I would have.' The Odyssey Begins, 1960 Horizon interview. The phrase 'hidden in plain sight' perfectly applies to Kubrick's filmmaking methodology, where everything on screen is purposefully chosen, even if the audience doesn't notice or understand its relevance. The saying is almost a synonym for eyes wide shut, a contradiction in terms that suggests something about the perception filters of the mind. Denial versus awareness, conscious versus subconscious versus unconscious processes. Kubrick doesn't tell you where to look or what to think, which forces you to look and think. This unique objectivity allows for a wide range of interpretations. Is Eyes Wide Shut an indictment of capitalism? It certainly doesn't seem to endorse it. Is it misogynistic, chauvinistic, bourgeois and pretentious? Or is it condemning misogyny, chauvinism, materialism and pretentiousness? Perhaps Wide Shut is many things at once. A disturbing satire, a scathing indictment of the grotesquely wealthy and those with sleazy bourgeois values who aspire to emulate them, a fantasy story, and a sincere, thoughtful study of marriage, sex and class, examining how these subjects relate to human perception and emotion, as well as the often unseen or imagined forces that drive us all. Eyes Wide Shut is not just a stylized marital drama, but also an alternative love story, an alternative Christmas movie, and a dream movie. Stanley Kubrick was perhaps the world's most successful creator of mainstream art films. He managed, like few before or since, to make interpretive movies that were commercially successful in popular culture, while also appealing to cult film audiences, intellectuals, academics, cinephiles, critics, artists, and fellow filmmakers. Amidst an onslaught of negative early reviews, essayist Tim Kreider offered a favorable and detailed critique of Eyes Wide Shut in his article Introducing Sociology. Kreider argued that the film's initially poor reception was generally blamed on a miscalculated ad campaign. The movie was promoted as a film about sex, featuring two of the era's biggest sex symbols and movie stars, Tom Cruise as Bill Harford and Nicole Kidman as Alice Harford, a real-life married couple playing an on-screen married couple. Naturally, audiences expected the movie to be sexy. However, Kubrick subverts this expectation from the very first shot, showing Alice shrugs off her dress and kicks it aside. He gives the audience a brief moment of what many came to see, a big-time movie star naked. As Kreider puts it, almost as if to get it out of the way so the film can move on to the serious themes. The screen then cuts to black and the paradoxical main title appears, telling us that we're not really seeing what we're staring at. In other words, Eyes Wide Shut is not a movie about sex, Kreider, introducing sociology. But Eyes Wide Shut is very much about sex. What I take from Kreider's point is that it's not only about sex, it's also about capitalism, psychology, communication, and so much more. Kubrick and co-screenwriter Frederick Raphael adapted Eyes Wide Shut from a 1926 novella by Austrian writer Arthur Schnitzler. The original German title of this source material is Traumnovelle, which translates to dream story. So, maybe Eyes Wide Shut is at its core more about dreams. The movie touches on a wide array of works of art, genres, and subjects spanning thousands of years, including ancient myths such as Helen of Troy and the tale of Cupid and Psyche, Beethoven's opera Fidelio, the 19th century ballet Giselle, John Milton's 17th century masque Comus, and classic children's fantasy stories like L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. There are also surprising connections to Kubrick's own films and a diverse range of other movies, such as Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, 1968, Woody Allen's Manhattan, 1979, Paul Mazursky's Bloom in Love, 1973, and Hans Richter's Dreams That Money Can Buy, 1947. And there are stunning metacinematic elements in Eyes Wide Shut, where real-life details surrounding Stanley Kubrick, his family, and others associated with the film are riddled throughout and interconnected in often uncanny ways. Which connections were consciously orchestrated by Kubrick and which are incidental remains the subject of ongoing debate, but ultimately, it's inconsequential. We see what we see. Some linkages are more obviously meaningful, while others are more nuanced and supplemental. However, given Kubrick's well-documented obsessiveness about every aspect of his films, it's reasonable to assume that little to nothing in Eyes Wide Shut is left to happenstance.